My name's Stewart Moore. I'm the CEO and founder of EarthCheck, and it's my absolute pleasure to chair this afternoon's Winnow and EarthCheck Waste Forum. The theme for this afternoon is Reset, Rebuild and Regenerate. And I know to all of you out there that will be top in mind in a post-COVID recovery period. This afternoon we'll be looking at industry perspectives on how to design waste out of your reopening strategy in 2021. Next slide, please. We've got a full agenda this afternoon. What I'd like to do is to briefly walk you through our presenters and our panelists. After my opening remarks, I'm going to introduce Brad Weller from Winnow. Brad is the Managing Director, APAC and Global Head, Hotels and Resorts. And then we're going to move into a discussion panel, and that discussion panel will be moderated by Yen Lee Yap. And at that point, Yen will actually introduce in a more formal sense our two panelists, the first of which is Nigel Moore, Senior Vice President, Food and Beverage, Southeast Asia, Japan and South Korea for Accor, and Rubio, who's the Director of Environmental, Social and Governance for Wynn Resorts, Macau. We'll then move into a Q&A session. At this point, I would like to invite you all to take active participation this afternoon in our forum. We'd love to see your comments and your questions. Please feel very free to put them into the Q&A and chat function that you'll find on your screens. The Q&A will last for approximately 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to a closing remarks about 1:55 this afternoon for close two. Next slide, please. Next slide. So if I can just set the scene in terms of the nature of the challenge, that we know about a third of food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. And we know that by 2050, that will reach about 3.5 billion tonnes. And more specifically, in relation to today's discussion, tourism is responsible for in order of about 8 to 10 million tonnes. And if we were to include both domestic and international supply chains, we'd expect that to be as high as 35 million tonnes. Next slide, please. And what that equates to is that 45% of all fruits and vegetables produced globally are wasted. It's about 1.6 billion tonnes of food wasted across the global supply chain. That equates to about 1.2 trillion in lost or wasted food. And from a climate perspective, we know that 8% of global emissions are associated with waste. Next slide, please. What we also know is that within 3 years, we expect to be back to, from a demand perspective, 2019 levels. And what that means is that by 2025, that's about 1.6 billion people traveling the planet. So from a demand perspective, that will come back within the next 3 years. Next slide, please. But what we have learned and what from COVID-19 is that we've had systematic shock. So climate change is now a reality and needs to be factored into our business plans. The carbon economy has arrived, and so has ESG reporting and scientific reporting for all of our companies. We now need to embrace regenerative principles. So that's moving from not just a discussion on sustainability, but about net positive impact of what we do. We know that we need to embrace design thinking in circularity in our operations. And we know that, and we'll hear a little bit about this today, the role that technology will play in innovation. And we also know that with technology in innovation will come disruption, both good and bad. And speaking of disruption, we now have the conscious consumer. They've always been with us, but they'll be asking everyone at this forum today, what are you doing in regard to waste? And more particularly, what are you doing to reduce your environmental footprint? Next slide, please. The EarthCheck program is the world's leading scientific benchmarking and certification program. And it works right across the supply chain. If there's one thing I've learned over 30 years, is that you can't manage what you don't measure. So simple measurement provides a rallying and point for action, and it also places a point for celebration. Next slide, please. The EarthCheck software program provides an online platform for environmental benchmarking of your both social and environmental footprint. It measures and tracks performance against key indicators. There are 10 core indicators, which include waste, And what that allows you to do in your portfolio and in your business to understand what your total waste generated is, how much is sent to landfill, how much is either incinerated or recycled or reused, and just as importantly, your carbon footprint or the emissions associated with the waste on your property or within your portfolio. Thank you. Next slide. And what that allows us to do from a benchmarking perspective, and I've just picked one region. We could have picked regions from over 70 countries around the world, but if we look at total kilograms of uncompacted waste generation per guest night, what it shows us in terms of the regional average for properties and regional best practices, there's considerable opportunity for improvement in every operation that we look at. There's the opportunity for the discussion today. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, market learnings is you need to establish a very clear plan and have a clear message for your staff. You have to work collaboratively, not just within your departments, but I think in 2021, it's about working with your guests. They need to become part of the solution, as well as your suppliers. It is true that what gets measured gets managed. And the whole reason of having EarthCheck is to establish a baseline holistically for your operation. It is about training and capacity building across your workforce, and it's about starting at small steps. It doesn't matter where you sit today, that you can always start the process by taking small steps in terms of measurement. Last slide, please. So the call to action today is that we do need to address solid waste. It needs to be an integral part of our reopening or recovery. We need to take a holistic view right across your operation, across all departments. We need to have a look at the role that measurement and technology needs to play, and we'll talk about that in all of our discussions this afternoon. And more particularly, we'll also learn this afternoon about what insights we can gather from operators who have already opened. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, and we'll move on to the next slide. At this point, I would like to introduce Brad Weller. He's the Managing Director of APAC and Global Head Hotels and Resorts. Just a few words for Brad. I know he'd be upset if I didn't give a few words from his bio. He has 30 years leading global teams in organisational and individual transformation across multiple sectors, including consumer packaging, green chemicals, hospitality, and technology. Over to you, Brad.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Stewart, and thank you everyone out there for joining the webinar. If we go to the next slide, please. Winnow is a global company. We're a technology company and a data company, and our business is underpinned by artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence helps chefs measure food waste so that they can kind of tackle that problem every day with insights and data. And Winnow also helps leadership teams around the world benchmark performance across kitchens and help support those teams to reduce the carbon footprint. And we're in 40 countries supporting something like 27 languages, and we're just really starting the journey after 8 years, but we're kind of fairly well positioned because of the client portfolio we're fortunate enough to work with, and that we have offices around the world working in different culinary environments. We've seen some really interesting insights come through in the last 12 months, and I wanted to take an opportunity to share those with you. Next slide, please. Everybody's really in a different spot. We were talking when the panel was kind of warming up that the world's in really different places. We moved from full lockdown all the way to full opening in places like China and everywhere in between. And as we work with hotels to reopen and we get insights into what food waste was pre-pandemic, and now you can't even really call it post-pandemic, but where we are today, we're seeing these really huge fluctuations in demand. It's making it very difficult, and for the chefs out there, you'll totally understand what I mean. It's really difficult to plan. Guests fluctuate, menus have changed, teams have been turned over, and it's really made for a really difficult operating environment. And what we're seeing from that as a result is pre-pandemic waste as a percent of sales, food waste as a percent of sales was hovering around 2% globally with what we measure. After opening in the first month, all of the kitchens that we start measuring had a 50% increase in the waste driven by all of this change in demand in teams and menus. Next slide, please. And so if we take that a little bit further, we like EarthCheck, we're really drive everything from a point of baseline. So in 1,500 kitchens over the last 8 years, we have a really good sense of what waste was pre-implementation of Winnow's artificial intelligence. And we have a really good look at the post-pandemic baselines for customers that have been deploying Winnow for the first time in kitchens over the last 4 to 6 months. And so we're seeing again that 50 to 60% increase in baselines, which means people are starting the food waste journey with higher waste levels than they did pre-pandemic, which sort of makes this an even more urgent issue to try to manage through all of this change and using data to support what you're doing. Next slide, please. So another insight we had was, and these graphs are around the weight of different areas of waste: overproduction, plate waste, prep waste, and spoilage. And if we look at that weight distribution of what we've measured, the left-hand side pretty clearly shows overproduction being the predominant, with plate waste being the second. And I think it's relatively intuitive for those of you in culinary. Plate waste has shrunk. That plate waste ends up someone else's problem. They were taking that waste away from the hotel or moving into a room for room service or into the community. And that has been replaced by higher levels of overproduction and really interesting spoilage. And that gets to the difficulty in demand planning. And so we're seeing really large increases in spoilage, and that's where you'll see in a moment where image capture and artificial intelligence can really help procurement teams manage the spoilage factor and chefs manage overproduction. Next slide, please. So what? Some of the tactics that our clients have deployed, and I like it because it's fairly basic and simple. There really is no rocket science here. It's measuring what you're doing on a daily basis, working with suppliers on postponement strategies or just-in-time delivery strategies. We're seeing a real drive to simplify menus. And that's driven largely by trying to stay hygienic in prepackaged foods. And planning for rework, there's been a significant increase in donations and food being reworked and repurposed from breakfast to lunch and going into churches and communities. And finally, we're doing a lot of work with guests and clients and catering, where we're helping to message food waste for the diners or the people that are experiencing the cuisine. And we're doing a lot of work with the London School of Economics to understand guest and client behavior. Next slide, please. This is a video. It really captures Winnow Vision. It's a camera, goes into the computer. In that computer is the menu and the food costs. It's your menu specifically, and food is thrown away, and the artificial intelligence and the camera captures what that food is and predicts, in this case, that it's peas. The camera then, with the connected scale, every time a food item like these cucumbers are being thrown into the bin, it registers a change in weight. The camera has layering technology to isolate that food type, and then identifies what that food is and predicts it from a number of probable items that it might be. And in this final case, it would be French fries. And so we're, through artificial intelligence, taking rapid capture of food waste with incredibly high levels of accuracy and taking the human element away from that so that chefs can spend time cooking versus capturing data in a spreadsheet or on a piece of paper or clicking buttons. Next slide, please. So that's Winnow Vision with artificial intelligence and image capture. And this is just an example of looking at one element of food waste. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that we've captured here trimmings. And this was really one of the first learnings from Winnow Vision, is the amount of food that's being thrown away that is really edible. And if you look at this asparagus and kailan and white radish, you can see that food really could be plated. In the case of the asparagus, some of that asparagus in this actual instance was spoiled. And these images allow procurement to have sort of deeper supplier discussions. It allows chefs, through a very visceral experience of capturing images, to help with team training around trimmings. And then that leads to sort of the remedies on the left-hand side, like trimming SOPs, team training, yield analysis on trimming, whether it's a butchery or a garde-manger. And there's more value in trimmings than we ever thought possible in food waste. And there's an awful lot of weight that goes into trimming. So this was a really interesting early positive experience we had with the Vision technology. Next slide, please. So that's how the technology works. And while that's cool, it's really interesting technology. Really, the value that comes out of that are the outputs. And so if I could go to the next slide, please. Our business really is to deliver insights through whichever technology our clients choose. And we have a technology for each kitchen size. It's everything from Track, which is an app with a simple menu for capture of food waste data in a kiosk or a coffee shop, to Winnow Waste Monitor, which is a digital scale connected to a screen for manual entry of food items, all the way up to high volume kitchens with Winnow Vision with artificial intelligence, which you saw a little bit earlier. So the data coming out of the tech is really what drives the improvement and the reporting of that data on a monthly, weekly basis for chefs, and then across teams and enterprise leaders that look to monitor kitchen performance across countries and across regions, as well as sharing best practices between the business. Next slide, please. So really happy to connect with anybody that would like to know a little bit more about this, or if you just want to talk about what your issues are absent our technology, our team would love to have a contact with you. So thanks very much. Stewart, I think you're on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Look, at this stage, I'd like to welcome and introduce Yen Yap, who's going to be our facilitator or moderator for the next session. Just a few words, and I think they're important words for context, but prior to joining Winnow, Yan Lee spent 10 years working in sustainability, technology, and F&B. She's a classically trained chef who's worked in 2 and now 3 Michelin star kitchen in Singapore. Over to you, Yan. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Stewart. So I'd like to first thank Stewart and Brad for that great introduction. I think that's set the context of our webinar really well. And also to introduce our speakers on the panel. So we have Ms. Ruby O, who is the Director of Environmental, Social and Governance at Wynn Resorts Macau. Ruby has over 10 years of food safety and quality management experience, and part of her role is to enhance the integration of environmentally friendly and socially responsible practices into operations, and also, and I feel this is very pertinent, demonstrate that sustainable luxury is achievable. So welcome, Ruby. Thanks for being here for today. And then we also would like to invite or welcome Nigel Moore, who is the Senior Vice President for Food and Beverage in Southeast Asia, Japan, and South Korea for Accor. Based in Singapore as well since 2007. Nigel has 25 years of hospitality experience in 5-star luxury international hotels, and he's also very well versed in a lot of technological F&B systems on the market. So he's got a sound knowledge of digital solutions for F&B. And I think this is going to make a really interesting panel for everybody who's looking to find, the sweet spot there. So I guess I'd like to start off with a question for all the panelists, actually. I'm interested as a starting point for each of you, just to see, what would you say that the current circumstances, have they increased the commitment to waste reduction in the hospitality and food service industry? Has it kept it about the same or pushed it lower down on the priority list? And maybe we can start with Ruby first.
Sure. We definitely see an increasing commitment on the waste reduction, and so does other environmental and social sustainable practice. Because hospitality sector has an added impact on sustainability and more aware of their roles and responsibilities locally and globally. COVID-19 crisis is placing significant stress on food system and In other words, it's the food security. And the cost of inaction in response to food loss and waste not only shift the burden to the future, but the price of the response will also exponentially increase. Waste is our backstory. It tells the story of who we are as a society. And waste end up in nature and even highlight inequality of the society. So hospitality sector is recognizing that and its own potential as change agent and demonstrate commitment on sustainable practice.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Ruby. And Nigel, what would you say to the same question about how it's changed the commitment of hospitality?
Yeah, I think we work over 12 countries across the whole of this this hub, and we've raised our level, our game over the last 5 years tremendously. So we've come at this at a very, very, very high level anyway. So I would say we've probably maintained where we were before we went into COVID. But as we're coming out, different countries are coming out, different countries are going into lockdown at the current time. So it's a very, very, very confusing state of play at the moment. But it's certainly fundamentally at the forefront of all of our chefs is food waste and how to manage food waste. So certainly we've certainly maintained that high level. And we're certainly focusing on the new normal when we come out of this pandemic on how to operate. And I think that's going to be the interesting sort of subject of what is the new food and beverage experience going to be looking like. Already we see challenges just basically in Singapore. And do we go back to the buffet? Do we not go back to the buffet? Do we go 50% buffet? And if so, is it starters that are cold or is it main dishes that are buffet line? So it's going to be a really interesting 6 months once we come out of it. And I think the beauty for Accor is that we'll have different countries in a different spate of time. So we'll just learn from best practices from each country, which is the best way to go forward.
Right. Thank you. That is going to be, I think, fascinating to see how people respond across different stages of the their experience with the pandemic. And I guess then with Stewart, how do you feel, you worked with so many organizations all over the world. How do you see them responding to this, and how do you feel like it's changed their attitudes?
Yeah, I think there's two parts of the discussion. Partly was what Nigel talked about. We're in 70 countries. We see a lot of our clients struggling just to get back into business. So there's some really big steps that they've got to be taking. But on the reverse side of that, we see an increasing commitment and awareness. It's the whole awareness thing now to be a bit more transparent with reporting. And waste is central to where they're starting to look in terms of the whole holistic look at their footprint.
Great. And I guess then I will ask Brad, how do you feel it's changed, just seeing how people have responded also to Winnow, and I guess from the data that you've seen coming in over the pandemic?
Yeah, I think we started going into this thing with a little bit of panic, to be quite honest, right? I think everybody really concerned is what's the future look like and how long is this going to last? And what really surprised me, and I looked at the invite list, Yenli, of the people that are on the call out there today, and many of you work with the who's who of F&B, and all of you I know are very proud of what your companies are done, because if there was ever a time to greenwash something, it was now. Yeah. And we're having such meaningful conversations with many of these folks where in countries where it's been locked down, planning for the future, running business case scenarios. How do we make an impact coming out of this thing? And those conversations didn't start last week. They started 9 months ago. So I just think it's so great that the people on the phone work for companies that are really behind this. And so I would say it's accelerated and there's a greater sense of urgency.
Thank you. Those are all really great insights. Thank you to all of you. I just want to pause here as well and just invite all the participants who are listening in. If you have any questions that pop up suddenly when our panelists are speaking, I invite you to put them in the Q&A and we will get to them towards the end of the program, but we will have a full panel and talk through everything and then get to the questions. So do just click on the Q&A at the bottom and keep those questions coming in. We'll get to them eventually. And also to give everybody listening a bit of background, I would actually like to hear a bit more from Nigel and Ruby, actually, just briefly, what initiatives you've worked on, what challenges you've faced in the waste programs that you've implemented, because this is quite new, I think, to the industry, how much focus there is on it. So perhaps, Nigel, you can go into some detail about what worked, what hasn't worked, what have you learned from it?
I think the interesting thing is where we are with manning in the industry, and the lack of skilled employment in the kitchen. One of our strongest focuses has been building the right talent and putting the right talent into place. And certainly we've had our executive chefs, thankfully, stay in place in most of our key properties. But it's the junior team members that are coming into the industry, not understanding the impact on what they do within kitchens. Unfortunately, our executive chefs and leaders just cannot be in every kitchen where we operate. So we've kind of like put champions into place who are looking after the kitchens and championing the food waste programs. But in general, I think a lot of our programs have probably took a sort of seat on the back burner. We couldn't do everything that we wanted to do in terms of the programs that we had in the past across all the brands. What we are focusing on, though, is creating experiences for the guests. It's for me, it's fundamentally that we focus on the guest experience. Everybody's out there trying to do something different and trying to do something new. So if we can create a guest experience that is focused around looking at what we're doing, where the products are coming from, how we're using those products, sourcing locally, making sure that we're working with local communities. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure the chefs out there will totally understand this, is the inconsistency of getting product into the kitchen. So we can't get the right products into the kitchen. Some of the quality products that we tend to work with are coming in spoiled. How do we deal with that? What do we do? I think the biggest win for us is that we supported a lot more local food banks. We certainly got behind the frontliners, and we changed our menus. We changed it to what we think people wanted to eat instead of trying to sort of cater for the A to Z and do everything for everybody. So I think it's getting more streamlined was the success of what we've seen across the 12 different countries.
That's, yeah. I think that's really, really, really interesting that you've worked with the food banks as well. Just a really interesting way to fix a challenge. And I guess, so yeah, with Ruby, briefly, I guess I'd love to hear things about the initiatives that worked, what challenges you faced as well with waste programs that have been implemented too.
Yeah. So just to add on to Nigel's, it's very similar for all the F&B operations, especially with the manning turnover and so forth. So introducing waste reduction program is definitely challenging. And in particular, I would say we distribute food from post-consumer stage within and outside of the resources are particularly challenging in our experience. That's the dilemma of food safety that leads to excess food waste sometimes. Although I have been experiencing working food safety and quality control, sometimes these two pillars a bit contradict with each other. But coming from that background, I think I kind of surfing in the middle that between these two topics and concerns. So how to achieve and resolve and in a well balance between safety, health, and the waste issues. So we have drive quite a pioneer program in Macau, I have to say, where food safety enabling sustainable practice through collaborations of different disciplinary. So 2 years ago, we start our regular food donation program, and it's beyond just giving food away. And we are very thankful that we have started that, and during the pandemic time, it also served a lot of added value for the community. So the program actually is upcycling of our excess food from our day-to-day operations And we develop new product together with the NGOs by applying food safety knowledge and culinary knowledge and skill set. And one of the example that maybe I illustrate here is where we transform the food into a more shelf-stable product and give them, I mean, the operator at NGOs more flexibility to manage and handle in the training restaurant of disability, where they train the future F&B staff that back to the community. So again, waste isn't waste until we waste it. So that's how we want to go beyond just staying within the property, try to redistribute things, but we work outside of the property with the community. And I think that create a win-win solution for not just waste reduction, but adding value to the society, which eventually help the industry back in the community. So that would be one of the challenges that I have encountered for the past few years, but over the time and more understanding of the program, we getting more momentum in leading this and being a role model and making it like a food donation. Actually, there's a need in Macau and it's achievable. Yeah.
Thank you. So the thing that I'm hearing from both of you, like there are three things that I keep hearing is a lot about the focus on community and pivoting to find sort of innovative ways to make sure that you're working with the community and upskilling your staff as well in a very difficult time so that they become more able to stay, you have more connection with the community that you're around. And then there's also still concern about food safety, which I think is, it seems to be sort of across both of your organizations. And I think that's very telling of what is sensible for F&B right now. And it's great to see that you guys are really pushing forward with all of your programs. So I have a question just for Ruby at the moment, but sustainability has been high on Wynn's agenda for quite a while. And you mentioned a sustainability committee that was set up to help with your social and environmental focused programs, including the ones where you gave back to the community. Do you think you could share a bit about how you managed to keep the momentum on that, especially with the challenging circumstances? You know, I think in January 2020, when the pandemic was just starting, everybody was kind of going every man for themselves. And so how was that experience for you trying to keep all of that going?
Yeah, I think food safety and sustainability share similar fate in, I describe as a fate because it's when the good times are there, it usually put it into like second or third tiers. And people tend to say, oh, when we have time or when we have like good business, then we focus on that. But I think the COVID tell us once again, those are fundamental elements that give us business resilience, and also it mitigated the risk impact. So how to keep this momentum going, I think COVID actually helps. And it gives people more reflection of what is important, like health, safety, making the society an environmental thrive. So it's about better understanding. And in particular, food is such a centerpiece for everyone. And if we can have more awareness and address on food loss and waste and what is happening out there outside of the property, in the community, or even in the whole world, then there more value and treasure and respect to the food and also the people who grow, who slaughter, who harvest, who cook or prepare, or even those who create the packaging for certain reason to capture the nutrients, the safety, and the packaging to avoid contaminations of this. And at the end of the day, who is handling our waste? So it's all about respecting the people, the planet, So it's about putting the purpose into practice. And that's why in our company, we have created the sustainable food life cycle. So it's from sourcing, from menu design to day-to-day training. So we have added in sustainable elements and trying to raise the awareness for everyone who work in the food chain within the property and outside of the property to have more understanding of how much value and resources have been put into the food itself. And especially in Macau, it's very unique because we don't have our own food and products, everything basically import. So that's as a downstream of the whole industry. We are the key gatekeeper to preserve that value instead of like casually wasted or mistreated. So again, I think sustainability is a great way to be resilient and provide downside protections during social and economic crisis. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. That sounds very much like it becomes, well, sustainability has become a very much part of the culture of your organization and how you approach food and how everybody down the food system is expected to treat food as well, which is really excellent. When it comes to that, I guess, Nigel, that brings me to a question for you, where Accor Hotels has been putting a lot of emphasis on food waste reduction in the past years and coming up with lots of initiatives, partnerships with food banks, as you're saying, local charities, to the groups. I think it's Love Food, Not Waste campaign, and also with using technology. So, you know, with having Ruby on the side saying, you know, it's a cultural systemic change. And then here, do you feel like that is something that you're working on as well, along with the technology? And then, sorry, I know that was a long question, but also what role do you think the food waste mitigation was playing in your plans specifically for reopening?
Yeah, it takes that in two parts. I mean, it's part of our culture and has been for a number of years now. We've run our Planet 21 program, and going back 5, 6, 7 years, we already said by 2020 we wanted to reduce food waste by 30%. I think now by 2025 we're increasing that by 50%. It's certainly inbred into everything that we do. It's certainly part of my interview process with all chefs. All executive chefs have to be interviewed by me. I think it's just everybody has to own this. If we don't own it, then we'll never make a change. And the one thing that really sort of scares me is that there's this pent-up demand globally for travel, and everyone wants to travel. I just hope there's not a pent-up demand, especially in this region of Southeast Asia, of people wanting to have big buffets again. I mean, it's part of the culture of this part of the world, and they want to eat with their eyes. They want to see big lavish buffets, and if you're not doing the big lavish buffet, then there is a challenge. So it's going to be a really, really interesting way that we come out of this, and those hotels that come out thinking along the lines of food waste and how it happens and the way that we handle it, I think we'll be a lot more honest to ourselves. I think we've got to be very much honest to ourselves, and I think it's down to our teams to really sort of take this and run with it. It's not going to be an easy coming out the next 6 months. I think it's going to be a really tough area because there's going to be so many different business models. The hotels are looking top line. People are looking at getting revenues back into the empty banks. So we've got to be very careful how that actually sort of comes back. Is how I would say. Right. That answers one part of the question. It was such a long question. What was the second half of the question?
The second, I get carried away because I get very excited about this. That's why they asked me to host this. But what role do you feel food waste mitigation was playing in your plans for reopening? So I guess you say it's going to be a really tough time. You say there's going to be a lot of top line focus on the revenue. Where does food waste sit there?
It sits right at the top. I mean, it's as I said, we're working so much with local produce. The buffets, when the buffets do come back, we're thinking that it's going to be, in some countries, it's going to be pre-portioned. So it's the understanding of the chefs, the mentality of the chefs. I think it's going to, we'll have to try and re-educate our guests, and how are our guests going to actually come back and do guests want to stand in the buffet line? Are they going to be comfortable standing in a line? I mean, if you go back to some of the larger buffets where you have the lavish seafood, if you've got 10 people in a queue in Singapore, that's going to be 30-meter queue. So how do you handle that? I mean, do you then go and have 3 separate stations and split the stations across? Then all of a sudden you're not all looking at food waste, you're looking at manning and headcount power, and how do you manage that? I think it's a whole education of what we do. I think Europe will probably come out of this in a better state of food waste, because there's not so much the focus on large, extensive buffets. Look, I really love to get on this call in 6 months' time and have a magic sort of ball to say what we're doing. And I don't think there is a right question at the moment. I think we've just got to be very, very, very honest, keep it at the forefront of what we do, and work with the teams to ensure that we are reducing waste or focusing on waste, and it is fundamental in everything that we do.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in line with that and sort of the changing customer expectations, Ruby, do you see, because Macau, hasn't really had to deal with a big lockdown and come back, but how do you see the expectations of the customers changing as they've started to return? Like, do you feel an increasing demand from their side to increase your commitment to environmental practice, or is it very much you see it on the back end because you know all the numbers?
Based on my day-to-day observation and as well as at work, I have to say it is increasing awareness from the consumer. Because sustainability and environmental practice is basically from our day-to-day, from when you're buying a drinks, the cosmetic that you use, the fashion, the food, and the transportation that we use, everything has some sort of environmental and social consideration to it. So the knowledge and awareness is definitely higher than before. And in particular from Macau, our clientele mostly coming from mainland China, and they're very strong in implementing environmental policy. And there's like 14 5-year plan down the road that already lists out the requirement and how to eliminate the amenity in rooms and it's not a mandatory requirement. And a lot of our travelers to Macau are experienced travelers. So they do encounter all this shift into different practice and offering from the industry peers. Also, during the last week, the World Earth Day, so Forbes sustainability program was launched. And we also see Michelin Green Star and Asia Top 50, all this global hospitality and food service rating platform agency are blending in objective sustainability standard into the assessment program. So again, it's up to the industry player or anybody in the field to just comply or try to lead and create another level of luxury experience that share the same value and making meaningful connection to our guests. So I feeling very optimistic and positive about this change. And sometimes we are like contradicting ourselves whether the guests will accept this or not, but I think they are very open and they have experience on all this. So sometimes we just have to be clear about the directions, and I'm sure it will be fine by offering something that is more sensible to the environment that the guests will also enjoy.
Great, thank you. And then I guess coming around to, for Nigel, and in line with what Ruby just said about keen connection to the customers, are you sort of keen to engage your customers in the decisions that you're making around your food offering when it comes to food waste, and how would you communicate your priorities and targets and your values to your clients, because you spend a lot on like local food and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we're not sort of putting signs up saying, "Hey, food waste. Make sure you're eating sensibly." We've got to be careful how we do this. Obviously, as a global company, we publish our data on a yearly basis. It's all audited. What we're trying to do is preempt any guest questions and any guest problems. And it's, if people are coming to stay in a hotel, part of their reservation process is a heads up that it's not a buffet. It's a breakfast that's served to you tableside. So we're trying to educate pre-arrival. There is some hotels have actually put on their in-room TVs the actual processes of what happens when you go down to breakfast and how you manage yourself at breakfast. And a couple of the hotels in the resorts, where resorts tend to be a little bit more busier on the weekends with staycations, we try and stagger the timings of breakfast. So people are aware that if they want to sit for a longer breakfast, that they should come a little bit earlier. And if you want to sit and have a quick breakfast, where to go to in the restaurant to sit. So there is a little bit of education going on, but it's very, very hard to be sitting there telling people to focus on food waste. They still want to enjoy life. They still want to have the luxury. For us, it's all about experiences. And I have no problem of putting more of a lavish experience in front of a guest if we can control our wastes. And what we're trying to do is, where we're saving over the years on food waste, we're putting that back into buying better produce at a more sustainable way of purchasing as well.
Right. That makes absolute sense. Thank you for everybody's given really considered responses. I'm just conscious of the time. So what I'll do is I'll actually go around and do 1 or 2 questions for everybody. So to close up, and then hopefully we can start the Q&A, because I see there are a few questions coming in. So I'll start with Stewart, actually. So the question I have for you is that the industry is currently in full crisis management mode. So if you look to a future that's post-COVID, what trends do you foresee?
Well, we've just had a very rich discussion from Nigel and Ruby, but we've also got, if you look to the themes we've used today, the easiest way to approach this is have a look at those themes. So we're currently in a reset. We've all been talking about it just now: reset, rebuild, and regenerative. And I guess if you start the last one first, it's about, restoring and replenishing. So we're moving from sustainability into being much more proactive about net positive impact. It's a really key issue in terms of the trend moving forward. And a way of explaining that would be energy positive building. So the whole context of repurposing waste and showing that it can be taken back in. Ruby talked about that. I think there is a reset. I think Nigel talked about there's a social consciousness that I think is very rich now. I think that people are up for a discussion about responsibility. I know that's an education. Nigel talked about the experience, but how we see it, and the research that I'm seeing, is there's a very close connection between health, wellness, hygiene, and sustainability, okay? Which means I want to travel well. I want to be in a hotel that's also good for the environment. Yes, I'm after the experience, but I'm very open for a discussion. If you can tell me that I'm actually eating local food and this place is actually doing right for the planet, I'm going to be much more happy. I think there's a real big discussion there in the new market that's coming back. And I think the third theme was on rebuild. So the reality is, what we're going to hear about, rebuild it back better, okay? Every community and destination is going to be talking about yield and not volume, and they want to be talking about the realities of, for 15 years we've been talking about the blue economy. So innovation and technology, we're about today, also brings disruption. And I think people are up for asking really big questions on, we're up for the discussion, but let's be proactive about how that can be demonstrated. And I think all of our hoteliers out there, you're going to get guests arriving who are very knowledgeable now about the world around them, and they're going to ask really good questions. And we need to come back to them in a very positive way about what role they can play by working with us in creating the sort of conditions that we're hoping to achieve.
Great, thank you. I see, Ruby, you're nodding very emphatically there. So
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, with how the industry is opening right now, I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about what your priorities are like when it comes to building back better as a community, as Stewart just shared.
Mhm. So again, health, safety, service, food quality are absolutely important. But I see those are becoming the basic. And there's no doubt the competitiveness of the market will be more vigorously after the COVID. I mean, not just between properties, but it's between city. So as a whole, we want to build back better as a city and community together, that new and with reputational return visitor to Macau, so that we gain together. And it falls well with the concept of UN Sustainable Development Goals, leave no one behind. So applying to the concept and leverage what is capable and co-create things together. So food is being even more thoughtfully sourced and carefully served. And now we have more data-driven mechanism that help us to overcome challenge, and we share those data with our industry peer and food service industry in Macau locally, so that we all can fly and manage food waste even better than before. So basically, this is something that we think build back better as a community as a whole. That's the key.
Thank you. All right, so one quick question just left for Nigel. I think I have the same question for you. I guess, what are your top sort of 3 priorities to make sure that after COVID, there'll be more resilience and a sustainable recovery?
Continue what we've been doing. I mean, I think we've done a really good job in the industry. Continue what we are. Look to use the intelligence. I mean, obviously, the windows and the systems that are available. I think it's finding within certain hotels across the network where there is a room for margin. Where can we push it a little bit further? And I also think that there is hotels that are able to experiment and try different things. And I think it's giving the knowledge of what I have and building the right teams and letting the teams run with it and letting them explore what the new world is like. They're on the ground, they're in the markets, they understand the market. I don't want to sort of sit here in Singapore and reach out to the 12 different hubs and dictate what they should be doing. They know their business. I've hired them and the teams have been hired to do the job. They're in that position. They run with it and they just give me a call if they need some help or some advice. And I just look forward to getting back on an aeroplane and getting to visit some of these guys and girls in the kitchens and working with them closer. So I think it's working, talking and communicating with the teams that really makes us a different hotel company to be working for.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. I think everybody has been giving great chats. Because of time, I'm actually going to move straight to the Q&A with the first question actually for Brad. So this question is, hold on, all the windows. So question for Brad from the Q&A. I understand that AI is collecting and flashing data from the images taken, like what is presented. Are these only applicable to raw materials? How about for post-made dishes? Could it still read the waste?
Yeah, it's a good question. 40% of all food waste in the majority of hotels, 4 and 5 star, is plate waste, post-consumer. And so if we're not deploying artificial intelligence in every tool available, including engaging guests so that behaviors change, then we're really not attacking a really huge part of the problem. So specifically, I can talk about what we're doing there. We have a new technology. It's called Winnow Sense. It's specifically designed for post-consumer waste and plate waste. And it will identify contents on the plate. It has image logs available to chefs. And where we're driving with this is to help chefs understand what's not being consumed, why isn't it being consumed, and how can we change menus to reduce the amount of plate waste. And then I mentioned earlier the work with the London School of Economics to do behavioral studies to understand what kind of messaging can be impactful to change guest behavior, but that won't damage brand standard. Because at the end of the day, a Sofitel or a Fairmont has a specific brand standard that each property needs to line up against. And so we want to change and influence guest behavior in a very positive way that doesn't damage brand standards. So thanks for the question. Post-consumer is super, super important.
Okay, great. And then I have one question for Stewart for the Q&A, which is, well, I think this is for Stewart. What technology solutions is Winnow offering, or is the panel recommending for businesses to use to dispose of food waste with a lower environmental impact?
So I guess it almost follows Brad's presentation that we really got to be looking right at the front of this. So what we're purchasing, what's the supply chain? We have to be measuring everything that comes in. We have to be working with Nigel's guys who understand what's on their menus. And from there, we need to be managing what's being used and what's being wasted. Look, it all comes back to metrics. And what I've learned from the discussion this afternoon is if we have a good hold on everything that comes in and how it's directed and what goes into waste, we have an ability to then improve and better deliver both less waste, but also maintain more quality. So Nigel's perspective was it's about efficiency. The more efficiency we have, we buy better produce, and better local produce. So look, I've answered in a roundabout way, but I think all of those issues have to come together in terms of a holistic way of managing waste better in a kitchen or an operating environment.
Mm-hmm.
And the part of that question, Yin Lee, that was around what technologies are deployed, there is some really interesting stuff out there. I mean, Winnow certainly wants to solve the problem before it's a problem, but there are digesters that digest food waste that goes directly into water and the sewage. Those are incredible, and they're varying sizes and volumes, and they're being deployed quite rapidly, at least across this region. And then government grants are available for some of the heavy lifting and capital asset intensive things like food waste compressors that take water out of the waste to significantly reduce weight to landfill. So there are those things that the folks on the phone can explore as well.
Great. Thank you. So I'm afraid that because we've had such a lively discussion, we've got lots and lots of Q&A to get through and not enough time. So what we will do is we do want to answer all of your questions. I'm reading through them and they are great questions. So we will take them offline, and I'm going to hand over to Stewart now to wrap up. And thanks for everybody for joining.
So I guess most importantly, thank you again for managing that session. Look, from my perspective, I think there's been some very good advice and some learnings from all speakers. Perhaps if I can just pick a few of them. The first one is everyone talked about that we're in a difficult operating environment. But what came out of, I think, Brad's discussion, and it was picked up with Nigel and Ruby, was that measurement is critical, and that sites without measurement tools appear to be wasting more post-pandemic. So measurement was the key issue that I think came out of all discussions. The second thing that came out of Ruby's discussion and was picked up in the other panelists was about you've got to take a holistic approach to this. You've got to work with your teams, but I think from Ruby's perspective, you work with your community. Everyone has to be involved in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in a broader sense. The third thing was about the teams, and I guess that's the education component that Nigel talked about. He gives them responsibility, but I think what came out of that is that there is a role for us to work with the consumer, so there's a new consciousness that we can work for better outcomes. And lastly, we talked about some of the technology options that Brad was talking about there. Of our three key themes today, that to me is one of the most exciting things. It's the blue economy, it's about innovation, and that's, I guess, why it's been so exciting working with all of everyone today, but particularly Winnow. So thank you, speakers and panelists. Thank you, audience. Please come back if our questions. We'll come back to you. We will reach out to you with some more information. I know Brad's putting together with ourselves a small worksheet. And I guess the reality of that is that we really welcomed everyone's feedback today and look forward to working with you into the future. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Stewart. Thanks, attendees. Have a great day ahead, everyone.